Crete, May 20th, 1941. The pre-dawn darkness above Maleme airfield hangs heavy with humidity and the particular silence that precedes violence. German paratroopers are already awake, checking parachute harnesses in the holds of Ju-52 transport aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip across two hastily constructed airstrips in occupied Greece. In 4 hours, they will begin the largest airborne invasion in history. General Kurt Student's 7th Flieger Division, 22,000 men, will drop onto this strategically vital island, seize the airfields, and within days turn Crete into an unsinkable aircraft carrier dominating the eastern Mediterranean. The plan is audacious. The plan is meticulous. The plan, as it happens, is about to encounter a problem that Student and his staff have not adequately considered. Because whilst the German High Command obsessed over air superiority and naval movements, British Special Forces had been thinking about something rather more direct. What if you didn't need fighters to destroy enemy aircraft? What if you didn't need bombers or anti-aircraft guns or even particularly good weather? What if, instead of engaging German transport aircraft in the air where they held every advantage, you simply destroyed them on the ground before they could take off? The weapon they developed to achieve this wouldn't roar across the sky or announce itself with the theatrical violence of conventional ordnance. It would arrive in silence, placed by hand, timed with ruthless precision. It would be compact enough to carry dozens at once, powerful enough to rupture fuel tanks and shatter airframes, and simple enough that resistance fighters with no formal training could deploy them with devastating effect. This was the Lewes Bomb. And whilst history remembers the Special Air Service for jeep raids across the Western Desert and Mediterranean campaigns of extraordinary daring, it consistently overlooks the innovation that made those raids possible. A device that fundamentally altered the mathematics of strategic bombing by eliminating the aircraft before the mission began. By the summer of 1941, the strategic situation across North Africa and the Mediterranean had crystallized into a series of uncomfortable realities for British forces. Rommel's Africa Corps was receiving regular resupply by air and sea. German and Italian transport aircraft operated with near impunity from airfields scattered across Libya, ferrying fuel, ammunition, replacement vehicles, and fresh troops to frontline positions. These aircraft, primarily Ju-52s, but also Savoia Marchetti SM-82s and Heinkel THE 111s in transport configuration, represented the logistical arteries keeping Axis forces operational in what should have been an impossible theatre. The Royal Air Force, meanwhile, faced mathematics that simply wouldn't cooperate. To mount a conventional bombing raid against an enemy airfield required formation flying, fighter escort when available, navigation across featureless desert, and arrival during daylight or on nights with sufficient moonlight for target identification. Each bomber carried perhaps 2 tons of ordnance. Accuracy was, to put it charitably, aspirational. An official assessment from early 1941 concluded that only 1 bomb in 5 fell within 5 miles of its intended target during night operations. Against dispersed aircraft on a desert airfield, the prospects diminished further. And then there was the rather pressing matter of losing your own aircraft. German fighters and anti-aircraft defenses around major airfields meant that each bombing mission represented not merely a tactical gamble, but an attritional exchange that Britain, with its overstretched industrial capacity and limited replacement pipeline, could ill afford. You might destroy 2 transport aircraft on the ground whilst losing 1 Wellington bomber, a trade that satisfied no accountant and troubled every squadron commander. What made this particularly galling was the vulnerability of the targets themselves. Parked aircraft are exquisitely fragile things. The fuel tanks on a Ju-52 hold roughly 2,400 liters of aviation petrol. The airframe is fabric-covered aluminium tubing. The engines, whilst robust in operation, consist of precision-machined components with clearances measured in hundredths of millimeters. Introduce even modest explosive force in proximity to any of these elements, and the aircraft becomes, at best, a maintenance project requiring weeks of hangar time. At worst, it becomes a very expensive bonfire. The fundamental problem was one of delivery. Conventional explosives, whether dropped from aircraft, fired from artillery, or delivered by mortar, arrived with considerable fanfare and even more considerable imprecision. What the situation demanded was something altogether different. Not a larger bomb, but a smaller one. Not dropped from altitude, but placed by hand. Not designed for the spectacular destruction of fortifications, but for the surgical incapacitation of parked aircraft. The innovation required wasn't merely technical. It required rethinking what a bomb was supposed to be. The solution arrived in the person of Lieutenant John Steele Lewes, a Welsh Guards officer serving with L Detachment, SAS Brigade, the unit that would eventually become the Special Air Service. Lewes, described by contemporaries as intellectually curious to the point of obsession, had joined David Stirling's experimental raiding force with the understanding that inserting men behind enemy lines was the straightforward part, making them operationally effective once they required solving the explosives problem. Working initially at Crete in Egypt during the autumn of 1941, Lewes began a series of experiments that would have alarmed any safety officer possessed of even minimal survival instinct. His base material was plastic explosive. Specifically, the British variant known as Nobel 808, a putty-like substance based on RDX and stabilized with mineral oil. This gave him malleability and stability during transport. What it lacked was incendiary effect. Destroying an aircraft required not merely structural damage, but fire. Fuel tanks needed to ignite. Fabric covering needed to burn. Secondary explosions from ammunition stores and oxygen bottles needed to propagate the destruction. Lewes's innovation was to blend the plastic explosive with thermite in a ratio that balanced explosive force against sustained high-temperature combustion. Thermite, a mixture of aluminium powder and iron oxide, burns at approximately 2,500 degrees Celsius when initiated, producing molten iron as a byproduct. This is considerably hotter than required to ignite aviation fuel, which auto-ignites at roughly 246 degrees. The combination created what modern terminology would classify as a thermobaric effect, though Lewes would have described it more simply as a bomb that actually works. The final composition settled at approximately 1 pound in weight, 454 grams, roughly the size of a cricket ball. This was no accident. The dimensions allowed a single raider to carry upwards of 30 bombs in standard webbing and backpack configuration, whilst the weight permitted accurate throwing onto wing surfaces or tail assemblies from ground level. The bomb incorporated a time-delay detonator, typically set for 30 minutes, giving raiders sufficient window to plant multiple devices and withdraw before the first detonation triggered coordinated destruction across the target airfield. Manufacturing took place initially in workshop conditions that would charitably be described as improvised. Lewes and his team worked out of tents, mixing thermite powder with plastic explosive by hand, forming the mixture into standardized portions and inserting detonators with the casual disregard for personal safety that characterized Special Forces operations throughout the period. The mixing process itself required considerable care. Too much thermite and the explosive force diminished, leaving the device more incendiary than destructive. Too little, and the fire effect proved insufficient to guarantee fuel ignition. The ratio that emerged from testing, roughly 60% plastic explosive to 40% thermite by weight, represented the optimal compromise between blast effect and sustained combustion. Testing proceeded through methods that modern health and safety regulations would find rather alarming. Lewes conducted trials on abandoned aircraft hulks, scavenged from crash sites and obsolete RAF stocks. Early experiments with pure plastic explosive demonstrated adequate structural damage, but failed to achieve reliable fuel ignition. The explosion might rupture the tank without igniting the contents, particularly if fuel levels were low or vapor concentration suboptimal. The addition of thermite solved this definitively. The substance burned hot enough and long enough that fuel ignition became virtually guaranteed, regardless of tank configuration or fuel state. Later production, once the bomb's effectiveness had been demonstrated, moved to more formal facilities, though exact numbers remain classified to this day. Estimates suggest several thousand were manufactured between late 1941 and 1943, though confirmation remains elusive in official records. Manufacturing expanded to include facilities in Egypt and later in Libya as the front moved westward, with local production reducing the logistical burden of shipping explosives across supply lines already strained by conventional ordnance requirements. Each bomb required perhaps 15 minutes to assemble once components were prepared, a production rate sufficient to supply ongoing operations whilst maintaining quality control standards appropriate to devices that would be carried into enemy territory. The detonator mechanism deserves particular attention. Early versions used standard time pencils, thin copper tubes containing a spring-loaded striker held back by a wire restrained by a glass ampule of corrosive acid. Crushing the ampule released the acid, which dissolved the wire over a predetermined interval, releasing the striker to hit a percussion cap. The beauty of this system was its simplicity and silence. No clockwork mechanism to fail in desert conditions. No electronic components requiring batteries. Just chemistry and physics, reliable enough that you could set 30 bombs knowing that 28 would function as intended. Deployment technique evolved through brutal trial and error. Initial doctrine called for placement on the wing root near the fuselage, where structural members concentrated and fuel lines ran. Experience demonstrated that positioning the bomb directly atop the fuel tank cap, usually visible as a circular panel on the upper wing surface, produced more reliably catastrophic results. The thermite burned through the tank cap, ignited the fuel vapor beneath, and the subsequent explosion propagated through the airframe with satisfying thoroughness. Surviving photographs from raid sites show Ju-52 transports reduced to skeletal frameworks, the fabric covering burned away, the control surfaces warped by heat, the engines frozen in positions they would never again occupy functionally. The operational debut came during December 1941, when SAS detachments struck 5-axis airfields simultaneously across Libya and Cyrenaica. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. At Ajdabiya, a 4-man team led by Paddy Mayne accounted for 24 aircraft destroyed or severely damaged. At Tamit, similar numbers. Sidi Hanish recorded 37 confirmed destructions. The raiders arrived at night, moving between parked aircraft in darkness, placing bombs with methodical precision and withdrawing before the first detonations announced their presence. By the time airfield defenders responded, the raiders had vanished into the desert, leaving behind aircraft burning with the distinctive magnesium-white intensity of thermite combustion. Subsequent operations through 1942 followed similar patterns, though operational doctrine evolved as experience accumulated. Raiders learned to approach airfields from downwind to avoid detection by guard dogs. They discovered that placement on the upper wing surface near the root provided optimal results, close enough to fuel tanks for reliable ignition, positioned where structural damage would propagate through load-bearing members. The 30-minute delay proved generally adequate for withdrawal, though teams occasionally adjusted timing based on local conditions. A more extended delay allowed deeper penetration into friendly territory before the alarm raised. Shorter delays proved necessary when multiple airfields were targeted simultaneously and coordination mattered. The bombs proved effective not merely against transport aircraft, but against fighters, reconnaissance planes, and light bombers. The thermobaric effect worked with equal efficiency against metal-skinned Messerschmitts as against fabric-covered Junkers transports. Fighter aircraft, with their compact design and concentrated fuel systems, often proved even more vulnerable than larger aircraft. A single Lewes bomb on a Bf-109 typically destroyed the aircraft beyond economical repair, whilst a Ju-52 might occasionally survive with sufficient structural integrity for salvage if the bomb placement proved suboptimal or the detonator failed. Records remain sparse regarding specific resistance operations, though declassified reports mention Lewes bombs supplied to Greek and Yugoslav partisan groups operating against airfields in the Balkans. The devices proved particularly suitable for resistance use. They required no specialized training to deploy, posed minimal risk during transport if handled sensibly, and could be manufactured locally. Provided plastic explosive and thermite could be obtained through Allied supply drops. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe. Ground crews was reportedly considerable. The knowledge that aircraft supposedly safe behind defensive perimeters could be systematically destroyed by teams small enough to evade conventional security measures. Documentation concerning specific operations remains frustratingly incomplete, reflecting both wartime security classifications and the tendency of Special Forces records to emphasize dramatic narratives over technical minutiae. What survives suggests that Lewes bombs accounted for several hundred aircraft destroyed or damaged beyond immediate repair between late 1941 and mid-1943, though precise attribution remains complicated by raids that also employed conventional explosives or incendiary devices. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. German equivalent development proceeded along different trajectories, largely because German Special Forces doctrine prioritized different objectives. The Brandenburg Regiment, Germany's closest analog to British Special Forces, focused on sabotage operations against infrastructure and communications rather than aircraft destruction. When German forces did develop demolition charges for use against parked aircraft, they tended toward larger devices, typically 2 to 5 kilograms, prioritizing guaranteed destruction over portability. This reflected fundamental differences in operational philosophy. German raiders expected to arrive by vehicle or parachute drop rather than on foot across desert terrain, making weight constraints less pressing. American forces, meanwhile, developed their own variants following reports of SAS successes. The Office of Strategic Services produced several incendiary devices for sabotage operations, though these typically separated explosive and incendiary components into distinct charges rather than integrating them as Lewes had done. The thermite charge might be placed separately from the main explosive, creating two discrete events rather than the combined blast and burn effect that made the Lewes bomb particularly effective against aircraft. This reflected different supply chains and manufacturing capabilities rather than technical limitations. American forces had access to purpose-manufactured munitions where the British were improvising in field conditions. The Lewes bomb's particular genius lay in its optimization for specific constraints: 1 pound in weight, hand-portable in quantity, reliable time delay fusing, combined explosive and incendiary effect. These parameters weren't merely technical specifications. They represented a complete rethinking of how small units could achieve strategic effects. A conventional bombing raid might destroy a dozen aircraft whilst losing 1 bomber and 6 aircrew. An SAS team with Lewes bombs could destroy 30 aircraft whilst risking 4 men who, if captured, represented far less strategic value than a Lancaster and its trained crew. Post-war assessments suggest that several resistance groups across occupied Europe adopted Lewes bomb principles for their own operations, though without access to plastic explosive, they substituted locally available materials with varying success. The fundamental concept, small, hand-placed charges optimized for specific targets, influenced sabotage doctrine well into the Cold War period. though modern equivalents incorporate electronic timing and shaped charges unavailable to Lewes in his Egyptian workshop. Assessing the Lewes bomb's actual historical impact requires separating verified destruction from the considerable mythology that accumulated around SAS operations generally. Documented evidence confirms several hundred Axis aircraft destroyed or damaged in raids where Lewes bombs were the primary munition employed. This represents a meaningful but not war-winning contribution to the Western Desert Campaign. What matters more than raw numbers is the forcing function it created. Luftwaffe commanders responded to the raids by dispersing aircraft more widely, increasing guard deployments at airfields, and establishing defensive perimeters that absorbed manpower better employed elsewhere. An assessment from Fliegerführer Africa noted that airfield security requirements had tripled following the December 1941 raids, diverting infantry companies from front-line positions to guard duty. This represented strategic effect disproportionate to the resources employed. 4-man teams forcing battalion-level security responses. The psychological dimension operated on multiple levels. For SAS raiders, the Lewes bomb provided a force multiplier that made audacious operations feasible. For Luftwaffe personnel, it introduced uncertainty into supposedly secure rear areas. For Allied planners, it demonstrated that strategic effect didn't require strategic resources, that innovation in ordnance design could achieve what conventional bombing struggled to accomplish. Later development in precision-guided munitions and cruise missiles would eventually solve the aircraft destruction problem through different means, but the fundamental insight remained valid. Targeting aircraft on the ground before they could threaten Allied forces proved more efficient than engaging them in air combat or attempting to intercept them during operations. Modern anti-runway weapons and submunitions designed to crater airfields and damage parked aircraft owe conceptual debt to the principles Lewes established with thermite and plastic explosive in an Egyptian tent. No examples of original Lewes bombs survive in museum collections, reflecting their expendable nature and the circumstances of their use. The Imperial War Museum holds documentation regarding their development and deployment, though the explosive composition details remained classified until declassification in the 1990s. John Lewes himself would not survive to see the full impact of his innovation. He was killed during an SAS raid in December 1941, less than 2 months after perfecting the weapon that would bear his name. Crete, May 20th, 1941. The Ju-52 transports lift off from their Greek airfields in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying paratroopers toward their destiny above Malim. They succeed, though at catastrophic cost. German airborne forces suffer casualties approaching 40%, losses so severe that Hitler forbids further large-scale airborne operations. But that's Crete, and that's May 1941, before Lewes bombs, before systematic targeting of transport aircraft in their vulnerable moments on the ground. Libya, December 1941. Different airfields, different aircraft, different war. The Ju-52s sit in neat rows beneath the desert stars, fuel tanks topped up, ready for morning departure to resupply Rommel's forces pushing toward Tobruk. The guards patrol their circuits, seeing nothing amiss in the darkness beyond the perimeter, and positioned on wing surfaces across 5 airfields, 30-minute time pencils count down toward detonation, toward thermite ignition, toward the moment when strategic effect emerges from 1-pound charges, placed with surgical precision. What Lewes achieved wasn't merely a better bomb. It was the recognition that warfare's fundamental mathematics could be altered not through greater force, but through more intelligent application of force. That strategic effect derived not from the size of the explosion, but from the vulnerability of the target and the precision of the delivery. That 4 men with rucksacks full of thermite-laced plastic explosive could accomplish what a squadron of heavy bombers might not. The Lewes Bomb exists now primarily in historical footnotes, overshadowed by more theatrical weapons and better documented campaigns. But for a period spanning roughly 18 months across North Africa and the Mediterranean, it represented something rather more significant. It represented the moment when Special Forces doctrine recognized that destroying the enemy's capability to fight didn't require meeting them in conventional battle. Sometimes it merely required arriving at their airfield at night, placing a 1-pound charge on a fuel tank cap, and withdrawing before the thermite ignited. Those Ju-52s at Agadir and Tamet and Sidi Hanaish never flew again. The missions they would have flown remained unflown. The supplies they would have delivered remained undelivered. And somewhere in the mathematics of attrition that defined the Western Desert Campaign, those burning airframes represented not merely tactical successes, but a fundamental shift in how a small force with limited resources could achieve operational impact against a numerically superior enemy. That was the gift John Lewis gave to the British war effort in the autumn of 1941. Not just a bomb, but a new way of thinking about what bombs could accomplish when placed precisely where they mattered most. If you liked my video, please share your opinion in the comments box and subscribe to the channel. Also, turn on the bell icon so that the latest videos like this keep reaching you. See you in the next video. Take care and goodbye.